All right, let's get to it, friends. Thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Welcome to the podcast. A lot to get into on what's been an eventful and arguably an historic week in Alberta. All of this debate and talk about a possible referendum. We're now, I guess, at the end of the beginning and into the next phase of that saga, that being a vote coming up this October. Things have been building in this direction, although there have been some twists and turns along the way. But Thursday night, in an address to Albertans, Premier Danielle Smith outlined her decision to put a question on Alberta's future in Canada on the ballot in the October 19th referendum. What's interesting and controversial about this is the nature of the question. In a way, it's arguably not a separation question, in that there was no result in this referendum that would spark Alberta separation. But it certainly opens the door to a subsequent potential binding referendum on that issue and prolongs the debate. It's also possible at the same time, though, that this referendum in October could put an end to this debate once and for all. So it's a bit of a muddled question in certain respects, and I think is bound to antagonize both sides of the debate to varying degrees. But here was Alberta Premier Danielle Smith speaking directly to Albertans Thursday night, outlining this question.
But there is another way to hear from Albertans while we wait for our legal appeal to be heard. That is why I'm announcing today that I will be requesting our government add an additional question to the October 19th referendum vote announced previously. The additional question will be, should Alberta remain a province of Canada? Or should the government of Alberta commence the legal process required under the Canadian Constitution to hold a binding provincial referendum on whether or not Alberta should separate from Canada? Because this proposed referendum question does not directly trigger separation, but if successful, would ask Alberta's government to commence the legal process necessary to hold a binding referendum on the matter, the recent court ruling would not be applicable, and the referendum question I outlined could proceed. This question will also ensure the 700,000 signatories to both the Forever Canada petition and the Stay Free Alberta petition are respected, and the will of Albertans is heard. Kicking the can down the road only prolongs a very emotional and important debate, and muzzling the voices of hundreds of thousands of Albertans wanting to be heard is unjustifiable in a free and democratic society. It's time to have a vote, understand the will of Albertans on this subject, and move on.
Okay, so there it was, the Premier announcing this question. This will be on the ballot in the fall. We are locked in. We are doing this. So a lot to unpack here. We'll have a couple of different perspectives. In just a second, we're going to hear from Thomas Lukaszuk with Forever Canadian. Later on, we'll hear from Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard, and find out how all of this is going over on the independent side of things. Certainly there's some anger, but maybe also some division among separatists in terms of how or whether to embrace this. There's a lot of political risk here for the Premier, obviously. This certainly still has the political baggage of a separation vote, even if it isn't actually technically a separation vote. As I say, I think she's managed to antagonize both sides. What does this mean for her within the party? What does this mean for how the UCP is perceived? Now, she said in that address on Thursday night that she is committed to keeping Alberta in Canada. That's how she's going to vote. That's the position she's going to take. How does that affect her situation? And of course, there's also the progress she has made with the federal government in getting a better deal, moving forward on this pipeline agreement, making progress in reducing or eliminating some of these bad laws that she's identified. Does she risk now undermining that progress? And risk undermining this legacy that she's tried to build here for herself? And I think in a lot of ways, this referendum and whatever happens is going to define her legacy. So clearly some political risk for her, some political risk for the province. There's a lot of volatility and uncertainty going into this. But going into this is exactly what we're doing now. So what does it all mean? Well, let me get some perspective here from someone who has found himself at the forefront of this debate and really at the forefront of some of what went down this week. Thomas Lukaszuk, of course, is a former progressive conservative MLA, was a cabinet minister, was deputy premier, and he is the founder of Forever Canadian. Forever-Canadian.ca is their website. Thomas, thank you for joining us here.
Rob, thank you for having me.
Obviously, so much to unpack here, but let's just get your initial thoughts on what the Premier announced last night. Maybe an announcement that's managed to sort of antagonize everybody, a referendum on a referendum, but still, I think that the stakes are high with this vote.
They are extremely high because, Alberta has never been more divided than it is right now. Tensions everywhere. We saw it in yesterday's committee meeting at legislature where one man already had to be detained. So emotions are flaring. There is damage to our economy as we quagmire into this. But the fact is that the Premier now extended it. If 6 months of campaigning wasn't good enough to cause this damage, there is now potential of couple more years, because the Premier also introduced a new law that you can't have a referendum 1 year before and after an election. So it is so important to put an end to this as soon as possible. And it looks like October 19 is the soonest that we can. So the role of Forever Canadian, Rob, will be now to get all Albertans to sign up as supporters and then come out in large numbers on October 19 and send a clear message to the Premier that we don't want to talk about separation anymore, and we don't want any further referenda into the future. Let's focus on building our economy, and let's start healing these sort of schisms that have erupted between Albertans.
I think in a situation where you've got a referendum that wouldn't trigger separation, the idea maybe then that there's complacency that can lead to, or people don't see the urgency in voting and getting engaged. Is that a risk that you perceive here, and how do you counter that?
Rob, it's a great risk because, this referendum now will be sold as a non-binding referendum. But if we were to lose it, it binds us to a binding referendum and couple more years of campaigning on separation. At a time when things are actually going quite well for Alberta. Premier has been quite successful in negotiating concessions out of Ottawa. And why not build on that? And why not find proponents and investors in pipelines? But if we embroil ourselves in a couple more years of continuous campaigning to separate, that will undermine our investment market. It already started doing that. Foreign capital will have no confidence in this province anymore. So voter turnout will be key, because we know that referenda are unpredictable. We saw that with Brexit and many other referenda. So our job at Forever Canadian will be, as I said earlier, to mobilize as many Albertans, sign up on our website, forever-canadian.ca, so that we can remind you and get you out to vote on referendum day. And also, by design, Premier created a very confusing question that now has part A and part B. A lot of people will be confused. There will be a lot of purposeful disinformation, getting people to not only vote the wrong way, but go to the wrong polling station. Now separatists have the list of electors. So it will be extremely easy for them to start sending messages to Albertans and simply misdirecting them. So signing up on forever-canadian.ca will be key, so that we can get factual information out, get you to the right polling station. If you're outside of Alberta, we'll mail you a ballot. If you're a senior or you have mobility issues, we'll make sure that Elections Alberta delivers a ballot to you. That's all part of the campaign.
Yeah, you raised the uncertainty around the situation with the voters list, and there's investigations underway. I think that's one reason to pump the brakes here. The Premier even talked about this court appeal that they've launched. Maybe that's another reason to wait. I guess, why is there the urgency? Why does the Premier feel so compelled to put something on the ballot in October?
Well, this is a total abdication of responsibility, a lack of leadership that I have never seen in this province before. And I don't care what political party you choose. Premier had so many off-ramps. Elections Alberta told her that she can't go with the separatist question, so she hired government lawyers to help separatists override that decision. Courts rendered 2 decisions saying you can't go ahead with a referendum without consulting all Albertans, and particularly First Nations. I gave her an off-ramp because she could have just asked a question in the legislature and make this go away. But she plays this bizarre game where she says that she's not in the history of Canada to put a separatism question to a referendum. And the other 2 were Quebec premiers who were proud separatist. They run on the platform of separatism. And now she's the third premier in the history of Canada to put a separatist vote to a referendum in Canada. So, I stopped trying to figure out what she stands for. I think the premier in this instance has shown that she is an opportunist. She is trying to save her position in the party because, not all conservatives are separatists, of course not, but most separatists are conservatives. And they are within the UCP party. They are buying up memberships right now. So I think her prerogative is to save her political skin. And the future of Alberta and the future of Canada seem to be secondary concerns.
Well, do you take any solace in what she said last night, where she said basically that she would vote in the affirmative on what is essentially the Forever Canadian petition, that she's going to campaign to keep Alberta in Canada?
Well, Rob, that's so hypocritical. The premier has done everything she could in her power to stop the Forever Canadian petition. She changed the rules of signatures to favor the separatists. She gave them more time to favor them. She relaxed their fundraising rules to favor them. She hired lawyers to argue on behalf of separatists in 2 separate court cases. For her to come out right now and say that she will be supporting the Forever Canadian stance on the issue is just ringing hollow. And the fact is that if she truly isn't a separatist, if she wants to heal Alberta, if she wants to attract more investment to Alberta, if she really wants to build these pipelines and work with Prime Minister Carney, for goodness sake, why would you put this question to have a question and embroil Alberta in further division when we know that externally those divisions will be exploited in our CUSMA negotiations with United States, with MAGA, who's already interfering in Alberta. Nothing good will come of it. And ironically, she didn't even satisfy her political base. As I understand, separatists are as unhappy with this question as all of us loyal Canadians are, but for different reasons.
Right. Well, and so I think there's still some political risk for Danielle Smith moving forward. To hear her speak of those two sides and in a way kind of lump them together, to constantly say 700,000 Albertans signed petitions, as though somehow this is giving all of them what they want, or more specifically, everyone who signed the Forever Canadian petition, that she's somehow now giving those 450,000 Albertans what they wanted. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the petition from separatists hasn't been counted and hasn't been verified by Elections Alberta. So it looks like the premier also is taking now the position of a referee, and she's accepting that they collected 300,000 signatures. I have doubts about that because nobody has counted them. Plus, they were collecting signatures while they had a list of electors. So let's be careful there. And vast majority of those people who signed the Forever Canadian petition signed it because they wanted to block a referendum. This was a move in 2025 to block a referendum to begin with. So, a premier is looking for a cover. She honestly doesn't want to go into history books as the third premier in the history of Canada who put a referendum to the electorate on breaking up Canada. So she's looking for any cover, any excuse why she's doing it. But the fact is that this is her referendum. She's the proponent of it. And she didn't have to do it. She did it to appease a small group of separatists in this province at the risk and at the expense of not only our economy, but Canada's economy. But most importantly, Rob, I received a text message on Mother's Day from a neighbor who drove to Vegreville with his siblings to spend time with mom. And they got in a fight over separatism, and all siblings drove home, and he sent me a text message saying, Thomas, my mom will never forget this Mother's Day. This is what's happening. I had an elderly gentleman trying to chase me with a squeegee at a gas station because emotions boil over. We saw at the committee in the legislature, a gentleman lost his cool. He had to be manhandled by sheriffs and dragged out of the room. This is not good for our province. And Premier had so many opportunities to put an end to this and show some leadership. And Rob, I'll be the first one to tell you, sometimes when you're in government, you have to make decisions that may not be popular with a segment of your own party supporters, but that's what leadership is all about. You bring them along, you educate, You do what's best for the province. Well, yesterday was not a proud day for Alberta, for sure. Nothing good will come of it for the province or for the country.
I want to ask you about that committee meeting, and it was quite a spectacle earlier this week where, suddenly there was an urgency to discuss the Forever Canadian petition. Finally, you were given an opportunity to speak, but as we learned through the day, it was pretty clear that there was sort of an effort at constructing a narrative. And when the press release goes out before the vote's even taken place, sort of reaffirms that. But not something I remember ever seeing anything like that. And I'm sure in your time in politics, that's true for you. But just your thoughts on everything that unfolded that day.
I have to tell you, Rob, I was shocked because actually while I was speaking and UCP MLAs supposedly listening to what I'm saying and supposedly they had questions, all of a sudden there was a turmoil among staffers on the UCP side. So it was almost distracting while I'm presenting. Well, I learned a couple minutes later that even though I was just presenting at that time, even though there was no question called, there was no vote, UCP, inadvertently, but there is some kind of a poetic justice in that. They have released a press release saying that this committee already concluded and voted in favor of having a referendum on separatism. They fell into their own trap. But we also know, Rob, that the Premier pre-recorded that television address that was aired on TV, and in that pre-recorded interview statement, she already knew what the question will be. She already, declared what the question is. So this whole committee was a mockery. It was sort of like a dressed rehearsal to make everybody think that there was some kind of a democratic process and they voted and that's what they chose. No, the press releases were already issued. The Premier pre-recorded her statement. The Premier was committed to having a referendum, hell or high water. And she didn't care what the consequences will be. And by doing so, she definitely disregarded the separatists. And you know what? Even though I don't sympathize with most of them, they are Albertans. They're our neighbors. They worked just as hard as our volunteers collecting their signatures. And they didn't get what they wanted. She did a mockery of them. She's trying to somehow claim that our signatures played a role in her decision-making process. Not true. She didn't even want to hear from us for the longest time until the last few days when she needed a lifeline. So she then started using the Forever Canadian petition. And First Nations must be very angry right about now, but because this is a bit of an end run around two decisions that they want in court saying that they need to be consulted. And I think most of us would agree with that. So if the Premier was looking for a way to show that she is at least sympathizing with separatists, that's where her heart is, and that she doesn't care about First Nations and the rest of Alberta to save her political future, that was probably the best way of doing it.
It's interesting, too, overshadowed by the fiasco of the committee. It was also the day that the two cabinet ministers resigned, two cabinet ministers who had been on record saying that the Alberta government should not be calling a referendum. Not a coincidence, I don't think. And it's unfortunate, maybe in a way, that there's only two that are prepared to take that kind of a stand. What does it tell you about this government and this party?
Well, Rob, on that note, in that committee, that infamous committee meeting, NDP put a motion forward that before we even go with this bizarre question, why don't we at least consult First Nations? And oddly enough, no UCP MLA spoke to that at all. But part of this committee is our Alberta Minister of Indigenous Affairs. She was there in that meeting, and she didn't even say a word. She voted against consulting with First Nations. So there seems to be a lack of a moral compass within the UCP caucus right now, and I find this very unusual because I can tell you I served with 5 premiers, starting with Ralph Klein all the way to Prentice, and caucus usually challenged ministers and premiers, and in cabinet we would even challenge premiers and ministers. I remember many votes where Ralph Klein lost in caucus. He wanted one thing, caucus voted the other way, and that was sort of the beauty of having this diverse caucus. Right now, it goes back to that saying, when you're in a room where everybody thinks the same way, odds are nobody's thinking in the first place. And that seems to be happening in caucus and cabinet of UCP. They're all thinking the same way. Nobody's challenging anybody. And I know in my heart of hearts that there must be more MLAs in that UCP caucus who simply see how wrong this is, how this is going to divide their communities, and how this is going to affect economic investment and economic growth in this province.
Well, it seems like there's no turning back at this point, but you see at least maybe a light at the end of the tunnel if there's a strong Remain vote in October. Do you think that can actually put all of this to rest?
Yes, by all means. If Albertans right now pull behind Forever Canadians, sign up, allow us to remind them when and where and how to vote, and we will do everything we can to facilitate that vote. And if we have a good turnout, we will be able to put an end to this in October. If we don't have sufficient turnout, because let's not forget, Premier purposefully did not tell us one thing, what the threshold will be. Will it be 50% plus one vote or 75%? She's holding that back. She will decide after the votes come in whether it's satisfactory to her or not. Well, we have to make sure that we win so decisively that no one can ever suggest that Albertans want another referendum, this time binding referendum.
Well, in a way, we're just sort of at the end of the beginning here. There's a campaign that lies ahead, much more, forever-canadian.ca. Thomas Lukaszuk, appreciate you making some time for us here. Thanks for this.
Rob, thank you for having me.
All right, there you go. That was Thomas Lukaszuk, founder of Forever Canadian, and they are very much now pivoting into campaign mode to ensure that we get what I guess we will call a Remain vote in this October referendum. And we'll get to the other side of this debate in just a moment here. As I mentioned, Derek Fildebrandt from the Western Standard will join us for some perspective. A couple other voices I wanted to let you hear because I think they'll be relevant in all of this. First of all, this was Friday morning in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was touring some of the renovations happening at Centre Block, made a point of addressing what's happening in Alberta.
And I just wanted to offer a few reflections in that context about developments in Alberta. I think when I come to Parliament of the great Albertans, there's many, too many to list, their contributions from the first Alberta Prime Minister, Joe Clark, our youngest Prime Minister, of course, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Don Mazinkowski, legendary parliamentarian, from Vegreville, and that's in my lifetime. Go farther back, think of Maureen Irene Parlby of the Alberta Five, later redubbed the Famous Five, but who came here to Ottawa about a century ago and led the persons case, brought the persons case that led to women having the right to vote in Canada. Huge contributions of Albertans to this country in the past, in the present, in the future. And that's just one aspect. That's in politics. I can go into music, I can go into sports, literature, science, research, and beyond. Now, this building is in the process of renovation, as I said. It's going to be better than ever when it's finished. It's going to be up to code, it's going to be up to cyber, it's going to be a better welcoming center, better conference facilities, it'll work better, it'll heat better, it'll cool better, it'll be better, just like Canada. Canada is the greatest country in the world, but it can be better, and we're working on making it better. We're working with Alberta on making it better. Just a week ago, I was in Calgary with Premier Smith, and we announced a landmark agreement, the next step in a landmark agreement, on a wide range of issues. Very much centered on the energy sector, all aspects of energy, new pipeline, new carbon capture, opportunities to cooperate with neighboring provinces, moving forward with new technologies like geothermal, nuclear, others. A couple days ago, I was in British Columbia with Premier Eby, and we're committed to working together to moving forward on a series of exciting opportunities in British Columbia, from expansion of the port, improving logistics, clean energy across that province, working with First Nations to make British Columbia even better as part of Canada. And a lot of that progress will involve working with other parts of Canada, of course, the federal government, but with Alberta in particular.
Okay, so I think what the Prime Minister is saying there is maybe what we need to hear from him. not overly interfering in the process of the debate, but making it clear that he understands what's going on and he's committed to making sure Canada works better. So I think that that's admirable. Whether he's able to follow through, I guess, remains to be seen. But there's a sense, I think, or I hope, of how Mark Carney is going to approach all of this. Now, there's also Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who is from Alberta originally and for now represents an Alberta riding. And so earlier this week, he made it clear that as far as he's concerned, as far as the party's concerned, the caucus is concerned, they're all for Canadian unity. They're for keeping Alberta in Confederation, and they're going to campaign as such. Here's what Pierre Poilievre said this week.
So I'm a strong Canadian federalist, a proud Albertan, and a proud Canadian. I want a strong Alberta within a united Canada, and all conservatives will be campaigning for Canadian unity in Alberta, and potentially, we hope not, but potentially in Quebec as well, if the separatists win there. We believe that Alberta deserves a fair deal in this country, which means that we unblock the resources, we allow the oil and gas sector to grow, we get the federal government off the backs and out of the way of Alberta workers and small businesses so the province can prosper. Reverse the gun grab and other unnecessary federal liberal irritants, but all for the purpose of making our country more united, more affordable, and more strong. It is the job of the Prime Minister of Canada to unite the country, and as Prime Minister in waiting, I will begin that work myself. I will be campaigning across the province of Alberta, encouraging Albertans to stay as part of the Canadian family and encouraging nationwide unity for all Canadians.
Right. So the Conservative leader making his voice clear, and I suspect we're going to hear more from him through this debate. And I think we'll hear from others too. Already it's clear that there is a Federalist campaign shaping up or coming together involving some prominent Conservatives. Jason Kenney, for example, former Premier, has been at the forefront of a lot of this debate already. He's heading up a campaign called Vote to Stay. It includes former Conservative MP Monty Solberg, former UCP MLA and Cabinet Minister Travis Taves. And we'll see if others get involved. I think a lot of people are curious to what extent Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, gets involved in this debate. And so how do these various camps start to come together? What sort of campaigns do we see? Of course, there's no clear way to define either side. I guess there's remain and leave, but that's not exactly reflective of the question either. So that is still, I think, a component of this somewhat muddled question. But I think people understand the stakes. People understand what these potential votes mean. And for the separatists, the idea, I guess, that they need to go 2-0. They need to win this vote and then win another vote. How is that playing? Now, so far, we've seen some angry reaction from some prominent leaders in the separatist movement. Others, though, may be willing to play the longer game and see how this all plays out. So some discontent, some frustration, some anger, some division, I guess, on the separatist side of things. Joining us for some further perspective on that reaction, what this all means for the separatist movement, where this debate all goes from here. Very pleased to welcome back to the program Derek Fildebrandt. He is publisher, president, and CEO of the Western Standard. WesternStandard.news is the website. Derek, great to have you with us.
Hey, my pleasure. It's great to be back on.
So I think we're all expecting some kind of referendum announcement Thursday night from Premier Danielle Smith. To what extent, first of all, were you surprised by what she actually announced?
Well, I had kind of had it leaked to me beforehand, so not surprised at all. I had an idea of what was going to take place there, but it was largely in keeping-ish with what I had expected. I had expected Smith to try and split the difference between the Lukaszuk Forever Canada petition, which asked should Alberta remain in Canada, and the Stay Free Alberta petition asking if Alberta should become an independent country. Of course, there was some very odd, I think, court rulings with implications far beyond the independence debate on things like resource development, on duty to consult before one even makes a decision to proceed towards something. So she was split the difference. I think a referendum, to hold a referendum, is bizarre. In fact, it seems like the most Canadian thing we could possibly do. The Federalists win no matter what. The fact that we're holding a referendum to hold a referendum, it's like another Royal Commission white paper. It's very typical Canadian process. So even if we were to become independent, we're going to do it in the most Canadian way possible, it seems. So I wasn't shocked overall that she was going to try and split the difference. I don't think it's going to make either side happy. The question is it enough?
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, so she takes the first part of I guess the forever Canadian question and then sort of mashes it up with an interpretation of the Stay Free Alberta question. But when she says, to start the legal process toward a binding referendum, I mean, isn't the appeal of that court decision already that legal process? If that court decision's overturned, that petition is sitting there waiting to be verified. There's the process, isn't it?
Well, sure, but these things take years. You remember the Alberta and other provinces fight in the Supreme Court. Well, actually, you have to go through several levels of courts, but against the carbon tax, against the No More Pipelines bill, these kinds of things take years and years. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge, so I can only give my best kind of armchair quarterback perspective on it. But it's essentially ruled that Alberta's not allowed to have a clear question. Now that might get overturned, but it says Alberta can't have a clear question. And I saw that as not just intruding on the political realm, but it's actually intruding on the previous, both the Federal Clarity Act from the late 90s, but as well as the Supreme Court of Canada's Secession Reference Act case. So you need to have a clear majority on a clear question. And one way, there's several, but one way that the Alberta independence movement is very different from Quebec's independence movement, at least historically, is that Alberta's independence movement wanted nothing to do with these convoluted, complicated questions, sovereignty association. I mean, the first one with René Lévesque circa 1980, it's like a paragraph long. It's like a good starter on a column is the question you're voting on. The 1995 Quebec independence question, less convoluted, but still quite convoluted, which is why we got the Clarity Act, we got these Quebec secession reference case, these things. The Alberta independence movement was always just like, let's make it up or down. Should Alberta be an independent country or not? Very clear, unambiguous. And if you get a clear majority on that, then you go forward. If not, then no. So in many ways, the courts here said, no, you can't. So I think the Smith, if there was going to be a question, it was by necessity a convoluted, weird, and overcomplicated question. We could have just put this to bed one way or another on October 19th. I know a lot of people in the independence movement think, well, this is Smith selling out. She's not giving us what she's supposed to, etc. But unless the province was willing to go ahead with technically speaking, an illegal referendum, because there would be an injunction against it, this was the best that could happen. And so she kind of borrowed language from both of the Citizens Initiative petitions, and that's what we're going to get.
There's divided reaction I'm sensing within, the separatist movement. I've seen some figures, Mitch Silvestri, Jeffrey Rath, calling this a betrayal or venting their anger. I get the sense maybe from others, there's a sense of, well, the door's not closed. Let's play the long game here. What's your read on it?
I think I find myself more aligned with the sentiments put forward by Keith Wilson. I think he's been one of the more measured and reasonable voices in the independence camp. It's, you always want to portray your enemy camp by their most extreme voices, and both sides will always do that in any political dispute ever. I think Keith Wilson has been probably the more measured voice in here. He's entirely committed to the cause, but understands that the courts simply would not allow it. Even if Danielle Smith were an avowed Alberta nationalist, if Danielle Smith had hoped to become the president of a Republic of Alberta, and I do not think those things are true, but even if it was true, there was no legal path forward to have a referendum by October 19th. We would have to wait 2 or 3 years, God knows how long, until this gets to the Supreme Court. And who knows how they rule. I don't know how they would jive it with the previous decisions around the Quebec secession case, but I think this is an extremely, extremely imperfect solution going forward. Essentially, it'll take the temperature of Albertans on if this is something we should go. I think it does de-risk the question a bit, because voting for the kind of pro-independent side doesn't mean Alberta's declaring independence. It means Alberta will begin the process. So it does de-risk it a bit. If that side were to win, or even just get a strong showing, north of 40%, I think it keeps the fight alive going forward. If the Federalists were to win by the margins that they talk about, they always say, oh, this is a small minority, they're like 25% or less. If they were to get a crushing victory of over 75% on their side, I think it beats back the movement significantly for some time to come. Probably not permanently, but it would at least for some time settle the question. But they would have to get a very big majority. The language on the Federalist side is triumphalist. It's we're the majority. This is a small fringe minority. They would have to live up to that. And this is part of, in politics, it's managing expectations. That's why when you ask a candidate for office, hey, what percentage of the vote you're going to get? They're always smart ones down expectations. Well, we're expecting a good showing, confident, but not too confident. The Federalist side has always been extremely triumphalist. We are the overwhelming supermajority. This is a crazy small fringe minority. Maybe so, but then you have to prove that in a referendum. And if they don't get that, even if they ultimately win, it then will permanently entrench the independence movement as a permanent political fact, or at least a long-term political fact in Alberta, and it doesn't go away. So this referendum has the potential to put it to bed for the Federalist side. It has the potential to further mainstream the independence movement and launch it forward with a win or a strong showing in the minority.
When you say move it forward, does it remain just more of a movement, a push for a vote, or does it crystallize into something more concrete in terms of a political entity? I mean, there is already, of course, the Republican Party. There's those who want to push the UCP in that direction. What do you think a more permanent separatist fixture looks like?
Well, it's a question I've wrestled with for many years. I've been a part of that constellation of parties and movements. The Federalists, I'll concede the point when they say that, these independence parties, they just haven't been able to attract voter support. I think that is in large measure because they're perceived as single issue. Even if they have a platform on a whole array of things, they're perceived as single issue. And, think of the Green Party. The Green Party is perceived as a single issue party, even though, roughly half of Canadians probably agree with its rather hardline take on environmental issues. So people might agree with the party, but they perceive it as a single issue. So the Green Party doesn't get most of that environmentalist vote. And I think the same thing afflicts independence parties in Alberta. Even if they were to be well-funded, well-organized, well-led, they're perceived as single issue. So I think experience over a great many election cycles is that Albertans there's not much of an appetite to vote for what is at least perceived to be a single issue political party on any issue, including independence. But unlike Quebec independence, the movement is very polarized along ideological lines. In Quebec, you've got left-wing nationalists and left-wing federalists. You've got right-wing nationalists and right-wing federalists. And in Quebec, it might skew. One might skew a little more left than right, but in Alberta, the independence movement is almost uniformly found on the right. And the more along you go, left-right stuff might be a lot of BS, but for shorthand, the further left you go, the more uniformly federalist people become. And then you've got kind of moderate conservatives, which tend to be sympathetic to maybe taking more controls from Alberta, but not going from Ottawa, but not going the whole hog. So I think what is developing, the polls show that a sizable majority of UCP voters support independence. And I think anecdotally you could infer that among UCP members, it's probably even stronger. But the further up the food chain of the party you go, the more federalist it gets. Politicians want to hedge their bets, and this is still seen as the very risky gambit that it is. But if look, if the independent side gets blown out in this referendum, if it's sub 20%, then I think the movement kind of has to go take stock, lick its wounds, and figure out where it goes from here. Maybe it kind of goes back to more of an autonomist agenda the way it was in the Wild Rose days. Or if it gets a strong showing, or God forbid succeeds, I think the UCP more formally adopts this. If Albertans do vote, say, to give a mandate to pursue this down the next steps, I would be shocked if the UCP did not formally declare itself an Alberta nationalist party at that time. More ambiguous if it's a good showing, but not yet winning a referendum in the 40% range. But I don't expect that the independence movement's going to go the route of these smaller parties for the reasons I said. That like the Green Party, even if people agree with them, people don't like single issue parties.
Yeah. As for the UCP, I mean, first of all, do you think Smith is in any danger here now?
Yes, but she has so far navigated it, and I wouldn't count her out yet. She is well aware that no Alberta Conservative premier has finished even one term since. It is a treacherous business. The least secure job in Canada is being the Alberta Conservative leader or premier. She wants to finish it. Yes, she is a politician, and you should always be cynical about their motivations. And yes, she very much wants to finish it. But I don't think she's necessarily operating against I don't think she's doing something that she thinks is wrong just to cynically stay in office here, any more than, say, any other politician would. I'm cynical enough to say that, but she is in danger from both sides. I think she realizes, while it is possible to lose an election to the NDP, that has only happened once in Alberta history. But we can see the end of Klein, Stelmach, Redford, and Kenny. Well, 4 have lost to their own party. 1 has lost to the NDP, and that was in a weird election with a so-called split vote and those kinds of things. So she's the risk comes from the party, and normally from the right populist wing of it. It's an open question on if the referendum question put forward here is going to be enough to keep that okay. I think it will be. A lot will depend on her rhetoric. She says she's going to vote for the Federalist side in the referendum. If she's out there campaigning every day, giving stump speeches for the Federalist side, I think she will go down. But if she declares herself for it and more or less just lets others fight it out, she might be okay. But she'll get it from the other side too. The Federalists, I believe, are a minority within the UCP in terms of members and voters. But they're probably a majority of the caucus. The caucus is quite split, and I think they probably, based on my very anecdotal, very unscientific read of the caucus, and there's a big spectrum in there. She does face the risk from the Federalist to her is not from the members; it's from the caucus. So she risks a war on 2 fronts here. But as it stands right now, she is so far continuing to succeed at this wildly impossible tightrope walk that she is making it possible to walk.
Yeah, it is quite a tightrope. She did tout in her speech, the progress she thinks she's making with the federal government, the deal she has with Mark Carney. And, I think clearly Mark Carney is certainly represented a change from Justin Trudeau. But, is it enough of a change? Is this stuff resonating? Or is any of this, do you think, a threat to the independence movement?
At the last UCP convention in November, she had signed that MOU one day before in Calgary, and she expected to ride in great triumph. You've known me long enough that I'm rarely moderate in the room, if ever. And I found myself there as the moderate in the room. I went in skeptical, but saying, give it a chance to play out. negotiate in good faith. The membership was overwhelmingly opposed. They saw it as a sellout. We've had more come out since. My worst suspicions, my more cynical suspicions have come true. I mean, Alberta's now agreeing to $130 per metric ton carbon tax. Sure, the date to get to that has been pushed out a bit, but it's Alberta agreeing, period, to any imposition of a federal carbon tax on Alberta. So many conditions have been put in that I'm skeptical that a private builder of a pipeline is going to come along unless it's significantly de-risked by taxpayers, which should not be necessary. You know, we're talking another Trans Mountain here, and the taxpayer should not have to build it or even back it. So I'm pretty cynical that this is going to work out. But as you said, Mark Carney is not Justin Trudeau. He is, at least rhetorically and in style, if not substance, a lot less annoying and does seem more competent and pragmatic. He's at least talking about this. I don't think it really goes anywhere in the end, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it goes anywhere. But I think at least his style and his demeanor and his rhetoric does bode well for the Federalist camp, in that he is not the poster boy of everything you hate about Ottawa.
Right. All right. Well, an interesting few months ahead for sure. Much more Western Standard News. Derek, always appreciate the candor and the insight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right. And there you go. Once again, Derek Fildebrandt, publisher, president, CEO of the Western Standard. Of course, thanks as well to Thomas Lukaszuk from Forever Canadian. And yeah, we're just getting started in this debate, folks. There's going to be so much more to come on this in the weeks and months ahead. We've got more at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Also a piece up Friday at the National Post, nationalpost.com, on the Premier's decision, on the nature of this question, and the risks that this entails for Alberta, for the UCP, for the Premier herself, both in terms of her leadership and her legacy. But yes, this debate is just getting started. We'll have much more on the next episode, I'm sure, and in subsequent episodes as we delve into this campaign and as the eyes of the nation start to turn to what's happening in Alberta. So again, much more at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Have a fantastic weekend, folks, and we will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.